Hello and welcome to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today. For our free tutorial today, I actually took a poll over on Facebook to find out whether you wanted to have a 7 gemstone bead bar assembly, which can be used in a bracelet, pendant or in a bar necklace, or if you wanted a little quirky butterfly. And the majority of you chose the butterfly, so that's what we're learning today. Let's just give you a quick sneaky peek. Could be added to a brooch, turned into a necklace. You could do whatever you fancy with it. In a couple of weeks' time, I'm going to be sharing my add-on bail design with you. So that's something that you can certainly save this for if you don't want to add chain directly into one of those little loops up at the top. Let's get down to the board and take a closer look at the piece we'll make together today. So here's my quirky little butterfly sitting on a twig. Interesting little fella. I've made this a couple of times over the past 6 or 7 years. I think he's adorable. He's definitely quirky and he's most definitely not anatomically correct, as I am not a lepidopterist. That's a person that studies butterflies and moths, I'm led to believe. So for our tutorial, we're going to learn how to create this piece together. You don't have to add the floral twig design on at the bottom. I thought it was kind of cute, but you don't have to put that on if you don't want to. You could just simply fold that away, and you've just got a cute little butterfly. So the materials we're going to work with, I have gone for 6mm round beads, and I've got a rainbow selection of colours there. You can go for whatever colours you want. You could stripe them, you could vary them however you see fit. In terms of wire, I'm going to be using 1mm or 18 gauge. That's where we'll be starting in a moment. I'm also going to be adding in some 0.4mm 26 gauge to sit those beads in the main body of the butterfly. And I'll also be using some 0.6mm gauge, 22 gauge, to create detail and interest in those wings. You can use a 0.524 gauge if you prefer. The look will be very, very similar. This piece I've created with the 0.5 or 24 gauge, but I'll be demonstrating with 0.6 or 22 gauge because I've run out of this one. So we'll see how different they look at the end of the video today. So we'll be adding those beads in a little while. We'll just pop them up out of the way. And then let's pop this little fella. In fact, I might move those off the board. Here we go. So I have 12 inches of the wire to begin with. This is 1mm or 18 gauge. I'm working with raw round copper, and as ever, we're going to run that between thumb and forefinger to get that nice and smooth to begin with. We're also getting some nice gentle softness into it, so it's easier to work with. So around about a third of the way along, I'm going to put a little delicate, gentle U shape. So this is about 1/3 from one end. I'm just going to twist that over. It's not terribly accurate, but it's close enough, I imagine, for what I need. What I'm then going to do is make sure that I've got the longer side up at the top. And I need to start imagining where my beads are going to sit along the length of the body that we're going to work with for this quirky little butterfly guy to work. So I felt that I wanted my wings to sit relatively centrally, not completely centrally. So they're sitting between the 3rd and the 4th bead. So you can either add your beads in and then create the shape of the wings, or as I'm going to do, I'm just going to estimate where that bend will take place, pop my pliers underneath, and pop that back out of the way. So if I just push the wire against my pliers back in the same direction it came from, and again this is the side with the longer length of wire, what I'm then going to do is find a round form. Now you could use a ring mandrel if you have one. If you don't have one, then a lip gloss lid or something similar will work equally as well. Really, really inexpensive thing to have is a ring mandrel, and a worthwhile investment for your workshop space. What I'm going to do is just hold the mandrel above that section and just rotate the wire around. Now you will entirely decide what kind of shape and form you want your butterfly wings. If you want something much more elaborate, say you wanted a swallowtail, you can absolutely take some inspiration from the world of butterflies. Go and have a quick look on the web and see what you come back with. But I've made the lower section of that beautiful butterfly wing to begin with. And the next thing I'm going to do is just decide if that's too big. I think that might be a bit big, so I'm going to tighten that up slightly. Now, I'm not worried about having this completely as like an oval drop down at the bottom, or a teardrop shape rather. It doesn't matter if it's not completely rounded, so I'm happy to just pull that into position. What I'm then going to do is put my bent chain nose pliers just above where the line of the body would continue. So if I grab a piece of scrap wire, pop that over the top, you can see my pliers aren't exactly against where that body would continue. They're a couple of mil above it. And that's because when I start putting this bend into position, I want there to be a bit of space above the body. So I'm just going to make sure that that's all straight. It's all a bit wonky at the moment, but I'm not going to let it worry me. Because we warmed that wire, it's relatively easy to just bring that back into true. Now it sits reasonably flat on the desk. I'm going to again grab whatever my round form is. In this instance, an ancient wooden ring mandrel. You can keep those the same size if you want to, or you can vary the shape and size of them altogether. I'm just going to give that a bit of a squish because I think it looks nice. We're then going to bring the wire sharply back up and away. So I'm going to again put those pliers in just slightly above that line, which would be the continuance of the body. So if I pop that underneath, you'll see again that my pliers are not hard against where that imaginary line would continue. I'm just going to push that firmly back on itself. Now, if you wanted to make this in a double-winged formation, you'd need to start with, instead of 12 inches of wire, you would probably need about 18 inches of wire. And then you could mirror the shape back in the opposite direction if you prefer. I like to do my butterflies from the side. I think they're quite charming. It looks like you're looking at them from the side on. So you can work the design alternatives if you prefer. And we're just going to ignore everything else for the time being. What I will do then is just make sure that this is reasonably flat. Now we will be applying some wire to add those beads in a sort of beaded channel set. It's not exactly the same, but very similar. So it doesn't matter if you mark that wire slightly, because in all likelihood there'll be a piece of wire going over the top of it shortly anyway. So we've got the first half of our shape done and dusted. So let's talk about beads. I've chosen to use 6mm beads, and that's reflected in the space that I made down at the base here. So that's just slightly less than 6mm, but by the time I've allowed that to just gently open up, and then I can push that back so that these two wires sit like railway tracks or tram lines side by side, it'll all come good, and I'm not overly going to worry about things. So we're going to add in now our second set of wires. Now to add the beads in, it's entirely dependent on the size of the drill hole. Now these do have very large 1mm drill holes in. However, I've chosen to use a lighter wire because I think it gives a finer design. If you flip that over to the other side, you can see how light the wire passes across the back are. You can use whichever wire you want to. You could easily go up to a 0.5, which would be equivalent to a 24 gauge. Or even a 0.6, which is equivalent to a 22 gauge. What I would say is that when I'm getting these neat little coils of wire, setting those beads into position, it's much easier with that 0.4. So let's put him back up there for the time being, and we're going to grab our next piece of wire. Now I've set aside 18 inches of 0.4mm 26 gauge. This is going to be far more than we need, but I'd always rather have too much than too little, and we'll be able to use up scraps of the same gauge of wire to add the butterfly to a twig if you want to add that to your design later. So I'm going to find one end. Just going to give that a very quick straighten. We don't want to overly warm finer gauge wire. We want to be a little bit cool with it if we possibly can. So I'm going to take just a little under ½ an inch over the top of the design there, and I'm going to ensure that that wraps at least 3 times around one side of the butterfly's main body. Now it's not terribly accurate for those that follow butterflies, but it's more of a quirky design, and it's the one that was chosen on my Facebook poll today. So this is what we're making today on YouTube. So I'm just going to make sure that those 3 passes of wire are nice and neat and that I'm happy with them. and that I've tucked that end away so that there's no scratchy, sticky, uppy bits. I'm just going to flip the whole thing over for the time being, and then I'm going to start bringing my beads in. So I'm going to start with a little garnet down at the bottom here. Need to find the very end of that quite long length of wire. Now, as I mentioned, it's much more than we need, but I'd always rather start with too much so that we don't have to worry about trying to add in. Now, to sit that all the way down, I'm just going to gently prise apart the little U shape that forms at the bottom of the design until I'm happy with how that sits. Now you can see that the wire is now splaying apart in a V shape. That's absolutely fine. What we're going to do is sight that first bead. So I've taken the finer gauge wire over the top of both of those railway tracks. It's wrapped 3 times on the first side. Push it into position. Now I'm going to wrap it 3 times on the second side. And keep those coils nice and neat and tidy. You can, if you need to, just ever so gently tighten those up by applying a very delicate pressure to them. What we're going to do then is keep that finer gauge wire underneath the body. Let's move that as far down as we wish it to sit. And then what we're going to do is continue to just hold that finer gauge wire underneath and close the U shape back up so that you have 2 consistently distant sections of wire. So they're side by side like tram tracks, but it's often easier to set that first bead so that you know the exact distance. My finer gauge wire is coming underneath now, so it's gone around 3 times on this piece of wire, travelling underneath the whole assembly. I'm going to hold that firmly in position and then draw the tail of the wire underneath the second wire. I'm going to wrap 3 times again. So we've got this all open at the top to make our life easier. That's 1, that's 2 wraps, and then a 3rd wrap. Now you can alter the number of wraps you go for. You can go for 5, you can go for 3, go for whatever makes you happy. You could even fill the whole thing with lots of wraps of that finer gauge wire. You will need significantly more if you choose to do that though. So I'm just going to show you a couple of beads in this same order, and then we will fast forward to what to do after you've set all 7 of your beads. So let's just go for that second one together. I'm going to now choose an orange. Let's have a look. I do believe that that is it's either a chalcedony, something like that. Can't remember, it's been a little while. Let's slide that down into position. It's got a beautiful glow to it. Could be sardonyx. So I've taken the wire across the top of those 2 sections of the heavier wire now. My finer gauge wire is always travelling over the top with the bead, wrapping 3 times around one of those sides. So that's 1, that's 2, and that's 3. I've remembered it's a carnelian. Tuck that finer gauge wire underneath and then just tidy those 3 little wraps up. And then take that tail of wire underneath, draw it into position, and then wrap 3 times around the opposite side of wire. Taking my time, going slowly will prevent too many snags. The wire comes back over the top, and at present it has no bead on it. In a moment I will add in the 3rd bead. If I show you underneath, you should have something a little bit like this. And what we'll need to do is continue all the way along. Now you can, if you want to, tighten up the butterfly wing shape. And when you bring that wire around, we're going to add a bead on, wrap 3 times. You might find that you need to take the wire over to the central part. You don't have to though, you can take it on to the next section. If it lands in a place that you're unhappy with, you've got the flexibility of moving these beads along a bit. So if you see, I'm just giving them a little bit of a scooch, and in that way, what will happen when we've added the next bead just here, we will most likely be able to take the underneath wire back to this position. If that doesn't make you happy and you definitely want to take it to the central piece, you can scooch the beads back along. If that doesn't make you happy and you want to take it to the furthest piece, then you can again scooch those beads a little bit further along. You've got a little bit of flexibility at this stage when you've just set that first 2. So I'm going to complete this and I'll meet you back in a moment when that section has been completed. So I've continued along in much the same fashion And this is where my quirky little butterfly sits now. I've set all 7 of my beads, and I've got one slightly shorter, one slightly longer prong coming out at the top end, and we've got some empty little wing apertures which we'll detail in a moment. I'll take you down to the board and show you exactly where I sighted all of those wires as I set those beads. So just a little bit closer up, what I finally decided to do was to attach one of the sides of that little weave that we're doing, which is a sort of a 3 and 3 crossing over. I popped one in between those 2 wings. It just seemed to sit quite nicely, and this is where we have come to now. So in order to make the simplest possible design, what I'm going to do is just trim away the excess just slightly longer on the underneath one. Keep that section of wire for later, they're always handy. And what I'm going to do is put a little bit of warmth and heat and just put some quirky little antennae on the top end of this design. So just a little bit of warmth in there makes life much easier. The first thing I want to do is just kind of cross them over a little bit, and because you put some warmth and heat into them, they will be super receptive to doing that for you. Now you can have them both coiling around in the same direction if you want, but I think I'm going to have this one coming up and then bring that around. The joy of working with a beautiful quality wire like raw copper, I'm just twisting around the round nose pliers to get that coil shape started, is that if I decide actually I think that looks better up the other way, I can simply flip it over. So if I do the other one on purpose in a direction that I don't think will look nice, I'll show you how simple it is to work that back in the opposite direction. So I've just coiled that around a little bit loosely. Just going to flatten that down and then draw that up together. Now you could, if you wanted to, bring those together. It's a little bit like a heart shape. In fact, I quite like that. So what I will do is show you how to flip that over if you don't like that. I think that's what we're going to run with though. If you wanted this coil to be coming in the opposite direction, because you're working with a good quality wire, you can simply turn it over and then re-sight it. However, I really like it like this. I think we'll say that we did that on purpose, and it's got a little heart-shaped pair of antennae at the top there. So that was the very simple way to put a top end on. You could easily just pop a jump ring through here, or one of the wings a bit later if you wanted to, but I want to show you a very quick and simple way to add detail to those wings before we move on to creating that twig. So I'm going to be demonstrating with some 0.6 or 22 gauge wire, and what I tend to do for this design, simply because it makes it build up quicker, is work with 2 lengths side by side. Now I've chosen to work with 2 12-inch lengths of 0.6 or 22 gauge wire, just because it works the design up a little bit faster. You can do them individually if you want to. So I'm just going to sit them side by side and put the tiniest bit of warmth in there. Just get them sitting nice and ready. What I'm going to do is make a series of loops. So if I pinch the wire like so, and just cross one pair of train traps, keeping them side by side, not traps, tracks even. Keep those wires side by side as you create a loop. It doesn't have to be directly centrally to the wire, but I've just kind of gone off to one side of the centre. So I've got a little loop in those 2 wires that is side by side. They're chasing around as if they were train tracks. I'm then going to pop that onto the top surface of that wing. See how that looks. I actually think that would look better if it was up the other way, so I'm going to flip the design over. And then I'm going to pinch the looped wire into position. The finer gauge wire sits over the top of the frame. Pop that onto the frame. What we're going to do is take the tails of what is the right hand side of that wire and draw that up inside the little frame that we created. And then we're going to tighten those little wires that circle all the way around the edge up nice and neatly, and draw them back down underneath, all the while trying to keep those side by side rather than crossing over. You may need to just take a second to re-sight them, but that's how we're going to add the wire onto the frame. Now it's much easier to work, as I did in the example here, with 0.5 or 24 gauge wire. It's much more fluid to create this design. I have run out, I'm waiting on a big reel to come through. So what I'm going to do is show you in a 0.6 22 gauge, and we'll compare how that looks at the end of the tutorial. Much easier in the 0.5 though. What I'm going to do now is attach on the other side. You can pull those gently out of the way in exactly the same technique. So pinch the looped wire over the top, warm that tail all the way around, underneath and up through the centre of that wing section. Pull that firmly into position and then sight that neatly. Take the tails. If they cross over, just uncross them. Push them back into position. Now that's fluid at the moment, that's absolutely fine, because what the beauty of this technique does is it gets stronger as it builds up. So I'm going to flip the design over now and just show you one more time on one side how you can create more depth in this design. So you can get the wire to sit in whatever direction you want, or you can be led by it. So I pulled that around a second ago to get it out of the way. Just need to make sure that those two wires are side by side. And I'm going to pinch down again and loop the wire around. Sometimes it's easier to pinch and release the looped section and turn the whole assembly that you're filling. So you can see we've created another loop on this side. This is very similar to my chaos technique. And what I'm going to do is a little bit of warmth through the tails of that wire. Take those end sections up inside the butterfly wing frame. Push that all the way around, and then back over what is the top side. Just get those smoothly into position, and if I flip that back over, you'll see that that's already starting to build an interesting infill. So you can just continue in exactly the same way. You might need to rewarm that ever so slightly. It's much trickier, or not trickier, but it's tougher to get the wire to do what you want when you're working with the 0.6. So another thing that you can do with this technique and design is do a double loop. So what I'm going to do is pinch down on that train track section of those doubled up wires, loop it all the way around, and then what I might do now is pinch again and loop in the opposite direction. So this is one of the things that happens with the slightly heavier wires, is that they separate and they stop being twinned. Well, I want them to be twinned, so I'm going to sort that out now, put them back to side by side, pinch firmly down, and get a second loop. Doesn't have to be in the opposite direction, sometimes in the same direction, but it's the same pair of wires have come across the top, looped around in one direction, looped around again, sit over the surface of that butterfly wing frame, and then we're going to take the tail up inside the butterfly wing, pull that firmly into position. I'll show you how to finish off now, although we do have enough wire left over for one more loop-de-loop. We're going to flip to the back, draw the tail wires that you're going to cut away. Don't want to show you the same thing over and over again. And we're going to trim those very close to the top of the frame itself. Pop those in the scrap pot. And then we're going to tuck those end sections inside the frame. So it's just a nice way to build up detail and interest inside a frame in a semi-chaotic fashion. So just get those to sit nice and smoothly down, and then you'd use up the other wire to fill in. So for the demonstration piece, I used 4 lots of 2 lengths of 12 inches. So it is quite wire hungry. So on the one wing, I have got 4 strands, and on the other wing, I've got 4 strands, and I twinned them. So I did exactly as I've just demonstrated to you now. 2 wires side by side, pinching them to create those little loop-de-loops, and then attaching it onto the frame every single time. So that's with the slightly finer wire, and that's what it will look like with the slightly heavier wire. I'll finish off one of these wings a little bit later, and then I'll pop a photo up at the end of the tutorial so you can see how differently they look when they're done in just a very small difference in dimension of wire. For the last part of our tutorial together today, I'm going to show you how to make a little floral branch. To me, it kind of resembles the end section of a tree where it's got a lovely little bit of blossom or something on it. Obviously, you don't have to add this on if you don't want to, but I think it's kind of cute and I wanted to add it into the design today. So you can see I finished adding just a little bit of detail onto those wings with the slightly heavier wire on my demonstration piece, and the piece I made earlier has the slightly lighter wire. What we're going to do now is create this small twig-like branch. This is entirely optional. I think it looks kind of cute though. So we're going to work with round nose and bent chain nose pliers. I'm going to start by warming the wire through. It's around about 8 or 9 inches of 1mm or 18 gauge wire. I'm going to get that nice and smooth and fluid. So to begin with, I'm going to make a fairly generous loop shape with my round nose pliers. And if I show you that from above, you'll see that it's not a complete circle form, it's more of a teardrop shape. I'm then going to put the pliers on the long section of wire that's coming away in this direction, and the tip of the pliers is just shy of where the very end of the wire is, and I'm going to push very, very sharply back towards the loop shape that we made. Push that as sharply far back as I can possibly get it. Now the next bit is tricky to show you on an overhead camera, but not tricky to do. So I'm going to put those round nose pliers in either side of the long tail of wire, and I'm going to start rotating that wire around those pliers. So I get a second loop shape of a similar size. It's gone slightly on the skew because I'm not holding it completely flat, but if I just flatten that down, you'll see what we're trying to do here. So I've got a second little teardrop shape. It's a little bit too large, so what I'm going to do is put those pliers into that loop, open it out slightly, and just turn that around to reduce the size of the loop. Put the pliers in again and pull sharply back. So we're kind of repeating the same manoeuvre, and what you will need to do is put those pliers in and reshape as you go. When you're making this design, it comes out and you have to put it back into shape again. So I need to re-grip the second loop shape that we've made and push that wire all the way back away, and then we're going to create the third loop. So if I pop the pliers in, you can open it out slightly to get it started if it's easier. Pop those pliers in, draw the wire over and around to make that loop shape. If you need to make it slightly smaller, pop them in and rotate around, and then you can bring that back into the centre. So it's kind of a floral design. You can have as many little loops on here as you like. It does twist in the hand really easily. Sorry if that's annoying. Put those pliers in again, pull sharply back away from the design. And when you're ready, we can start tightening these forms up to make them a little bit more floral. So you can do that by hand. When you're working with raw copper wire, it's very, very easy to work up the shapes. Bring those round nose pliers back in again. Rotate the wire around the roundness of the round nose pliers. Shall I say round again? Round. Give that a little bit of a squish and a squeeze. So you can see we've made our fourth petal. Draw the wire back out again. Very, very sharp angle there. You can take a second if you need to just flatten that down. And what you will want to do at a point in time is manual adjustments to make it sit how you want it to sit. The round nose pliers are really a suggestion to the design to get those petal-like formations. So again, drawing the wire back in on itself, you can shrink that down if you need to. And then I think for the last time on this one, I'm just going to draw that wire over the very, very centre, pull it around a little bit, and then draw that wire sharply back away again. So you can see that it's rather undulating. You could spend a lot more time to get that perfectly to your desired form. I'm just going to use the very, very ends of my bent chain nose pliers just to tighten up all the angles. Could be a cloud, could be a starfish, it's whatever you want it to be really. That's the beauty of working with wire. Just going to tighten up some of these angles a little bit, and then making sure that it's completely flat. What I'm going to do is draw the tail of wire away, a little bit more heat into it. Now we started with 9 inches of wire, so you could have a very, very, very long twig if you wanted to. It looks a bit like a magic wand. I'm going to trim a couple of inches away, just over here, using the correct side of my flush cutter. So in the end, we probably used about 7 or so inches. That's a useful length of wire that I will hold on to for later. And then I'm just going to curl that wire around, whichever way you want it to go. I'm just going to put a little coil on the opposite end to the floral decal, and then I'll show you how to tie the two bits together with a scrap of wire that I had left over from setting the beads earlier on. So you can also use this as a way to hang your project. If you want to make a wrapped loop instead of a circle at the end here, there was certainly enough wire. I'm just going to bend that around until I'm happy with how it sits. You can manually adjust angles to your heart's content. So if I just lay that down, I think that's how I'm going to have my butterfly sitting on the branch. From that very long section of wire where we started setting the beads earlier, I've got quite a reasonable amount left. There's at least 12 inches, significantly more than we need for this project, but it's always easier to start with more than you need. What I will do here is I will wrap 3 times, probably in the middle of my scrap of wire, around the twiggy branchy thing. So I've got 3 really nice tight wraps around that branch. Now you can see that my finer gauge wire is coming over the top of the branch in both directions. So I want it to go underneath the body of my butterfly where I choose to add it on. So I'm going to add it around about midpoint. So what I will do is I will post the tail of that wire from the underside between the number 3 and number 4 beads and just sit that up against the body of the butterfly. And what I want to do is loop 1 time around the lower wire that forms the body of the butterfly and draw that back out and underneath the twig. Get that tail of wire out of the way. So what I'm doing is I'm wrapping 3 times around the twig, but only 1 time around the body. But because I'm doing this multiple times, it will become a nice strong connection. It's also another way that you can make jointed jewellery later on in your wire work jewellery making. So the finer gauge wire has come back underneath the twig section, so I'm going to wrap 3 times in this direction now. If they're a bit loose, your little wraps, you can tighten them up. Finer gauge wire has come down, so over the top of that twig and down. So I'm then going to post it back up inside the body of that butterfly. That sounded terrible, I don't mean it like that at all. And then all the way back around. So it's just a single loop around that lower wire on the body of the butterfly. The finer gauge wire comes underneath the twig, and then I will wrap 3 times again. 1 and 2 and 3, taking the tail of wire up underneath and inside that body section. Pull that nice and firmly true and straight, back down between the 2 pieces underneath the twig section, and then wrap 3 more times. And I'll do that until I feel that I have a really good strong connection to the twig. If I take you to the sample that I made earlier now, you'll see that you can see some back and forth of the weaving wire, which is absolutely fine because it looks like a bajillion legs. I don't think butterflies have a bajillion legs, but you get the point. It's kind of cute. It's a very whimsical little piece, certainly not anatomically correct, although you could, if you wanted to, be inspired by the most beautiful butterflies that we have on this planet. So that is what we have made today, a rainbow whimsical butterfly. Well, thank you very much for hanging out with me today and making quirky little butterflies. I hope that you've enjoyed it. I know I have. Next time we will be making this bar assembly using 2 different sizes of rainbow beads. Now that can be used in bracelets and necklaces, pendants, brooches and much, much more. So I hope that you will come back and meet me again here on YouTube next week for more of the wire work tutorials. Have yourself a beautiful day and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye for now.